and thank you very much for coming, and welcome to the Virginia Festival of Book program, Betrayal and Virginian Heroes, 20th Century War Stories. And I think you're going to enjoy today's program with two terrific authors. My name is John Dillon. I'm on the journalism faculty at Penn State University, and I've been associated with Bill Geroux for many years, and my colleagues at the Times-Dispatch have been associated with Bill Walker for a good number of years. So it's a little bit of a reunion up here today. So let me go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to introduce Bill Geroux. He's the author of the Mathews Men, Seven Brothers and the War Against Hitler's U-Boat. Bill and I worked together for a long time at the Times-Dispatch, and I was thinking today how his career, both on the Northern Neck as a reporter and in Norfolk, and then after that with the Maersk shipping line, has sort of guided him to be the perfect person to write this incredible book. Next to him is Bill Walker, who was head of public affairs at Virginia Tech, at Gettysburg College, and at William and Mary for many years, and is an associate of many of the reporters of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, who has also written a terrific book about not only battle but human nature in World War I. So let me go ahead and get started. Bill Geroux, I'll ask you first to talk a little bit about your book, and then we'll go to Bill Walker.
Okay. Hello. My name is Bill Jarreau, and my book, The Mathews Men, it's really the story of the largely forgotten exploits of the U.S. Merchant Marine in World War II. This story first came to me about 25 years ago. I live in Virginia Beach, and one day I was down at the ocean front, and I was talking to a gentleman in his 70s, and he told me that on a day much like that in 1942, he was down at the beach, in his bathing suit, wiggling his toes in the sand, and was startled to look up and see two American ships explode right at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. And they were the victims of U-boats. And I was just stunned by this. I thought, U-boats at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay? I thought, I was kind of grew up being interested in the war, but I thought it was something that had happened on this side of the other side of this ocean, the other side of this ocean. So I started getting interested in the story, just reading what there was about it. And in fact, particularly at the first year that the U.S. was involved in World War II, U-boats were all up and down our coasts. They torpedoed a ship right in front of the tourists in Florida. One of the U-boat captains wrote afterwards that he got close enough to Coney Island to see the Ferris wheel at night. And they would actually silhouette the merchant ships against the lights of our cities, like Atlantic City and Norfolk and Miami Beach. And the ships were blacked out, but if the U-boats sat offshore, they could see their silhouettes and set them up for torpedo strikes against the lights of our city, kind of like ducks in a shooting gallery. And the ships they were sinking were not warships, they were cargo ships. They were these old freighters and tankers, merchant ships, and they were hauling cargo because in World War II, as today and throughout our history, merchant ships are the supply line. They carry the supplies for our troops in battlefields overseas. And they carry, everything, guns, ammunition, planes, tanks, not planes so much anymore, but just everything the troops need to survive and fight. And they've carried them over to Afghanistan and Iraq. And the men on these ships they're not military men. They're members of the Merchant Marine. They're civilians. They sail cargo ships for profit from port to port. But during the war, the Merchant Marine is always sort of pulled into the war as the supply line for the military, because the military doesn't have enough supply ships, cargo ships, to haul stuff. So they're critically important. And in World War II, the U-boats, Germany, they recognized that if the United States could manage to project its economic power, its industrial power, and its troops across the ocean to where the war was being fought, most of it, if we were successful, they would lose the war. So they sent U-boats to our coastline, right along our coast to try to sink as many cargo ships as they could. This was the main thing, that U-boats, that was their main mission during World War II. And they were very successful at it. They were sinking ships all along our coast, at a rate of more than one a day. They were killing hundreds, thousands of mariners with torpedoes. And it got so bad during this, the first year of the war, that a publisher of merchant mariners' textbooks hurried into print a little volume called How to Abandon Ship. And this was a step-by-step guide of how to keep from getting killed when your ship got torpedoed. And it had advice on how to launch a lifeboat, how to navigate in a lifeboat. It even had a section on how to survive if you were marooned on an island in the Arctic, because one of the places we were hauling supplies was to Russia, which was our ally. And in this section, there was a subsection on how to kill and eat polar bears. And for future reference, in case anybody needs this, you shoot a polar bear right behind the shoulder blades, because you'll be sure to pierce his heart. You never shoot him in the water, because you're not going to be able to get him out. You can't cook him, because the meat's too tough, so you're going to have to eat him raw. And no matter how desperate you are, no matter how hungry you are, the book stresses this. It says, avoid polar bear liver. So that's the advice. Now, there's no record that I have found of a stranded merchant crew ever killing and eating a polar bear, or vice versa. But the fact that these guys included this in the book I think would give you an idea of how desperate the situation was. And I was just fascinated by this story. And the part of it that interested me the most was the experience of these merchant mariners, because some of these guys would get torpedoed. They'd survive, the explosions, the fires, the sharks, the flaming oil slicks. They'd come home, they'd get right back on another ship, and they'd go right back out in the same waters, and they'd get torpedoed again. A lot of my Mathews men were torpedoed multiple times. There was one guy that was torpedoed 10 times. And it was just striking to me. But I'd never heard of these guys. I'd never heard of their experience. So I began thinking, how could you, I was trying to find a book that told about it. And I couldn't find the one I wanted. And I began thinking, well, maybe I could write a book like this. But I wanted to find a group of mariners, that I could follow. I didn't want to write a book, this ship got sunk, this many people got killed. This ship got sunk, this many people got killed. I wanted to find a group of people and their families whose experiences I could follow, whose story I could tell. But again, this was 25 years ago. In the excuses department, I had a day job, I had a family, and I just thought, nothing came to me right away, and I thought, well, maybe one of these days I will stumble across the way to tell the story. So 20 years went by, 20 years. And one day, I was working in downtown Norfolk, and I was in the habit during my lunch hour of going across the street to the Norfolk Library and just going through the books, just killing some time looking for a book to read. And I happened to open up a book, and it was a book on yachting in the Chesapeake Bay. And I don't know why I even looked at this book. I don't have a yacht. But the book was mainly it was advice for yachtsmen. It's like, where do you moor your yacht in this inlet? Where's a good dockside restaurant that has a wine list? Is that kind of stuff. But I just happened to turn to this page, and this sounds apocryphal, but it's true. I turned to a page, and right at the top of the page, it was a page on Mathews County, Virginia. And right at the top of the page, the author of the book had included a brief historical note, and it said, essentially, while we were in Mathews looking at this, a guy on the fish wharf wandered by and told us that during World War II, a lot of Mathews men were merchant sea captains and sailed against the U-boats, and a lot of them lost their lives. And I just stared at this paragraph, and I'm standing in the library one day, and it just felt like a bolt of lightning had struck me. I thought, this is the story. This is how to tell this story, Mathews County. And part of the reason I felt this way is I had once lived in Mathews it was only about a year. It was early in my journalism career. And I knew what kind of place it was. And Mathews, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it is a rural, remote outpost on the Chesapeake Bay. It's a rural county. It's sparsely populated. It sticks way out in the bay. And there's not much in Mathews, and Mathews is not on the way to anywhere. And the people in Mathews have a saying that one never goes to Mathews unless going to Mathews. And it's an isolated place, but it's not isolated in a creepy deliverance type way. It's a friendly place. And when I was working there as a journalist, I would go out and interview people, and I would interview fishermen. And frequently, the fisherman, after if we'd had a nice talk, he would present me with a fish. He would say, "I caught this flounder this morning here." And I would say, "No, I can't take it." But he would insist, and it would have been rude to say no. So it happened so frequently that I began carrying a cooler in the trunk of my car with a sheaf of newspapers and for gift fish. And I don't know how many of these fish I accumulated, because you can't just set a fish on the floorboards of the car, and which I tried once with bad results. So I started doing this. I don't know how many fish I accumulated, but it was a number of them. So Mathews, it's always been more a part of the sea than of the land, and for that reason, Mathews has since before the Revolution has been a cradle of merchant mariners. There's not much to do in Mathews except fish or farm or join the merchant marine, go to sea. And I thought, if there's one place where you could go to reconstruct a 70-year-old war story that people have forgotten about, it's Mathews. Because everybody in Mathews knows everybody else. A lot of the people that live in Mathews have always lived in Mathews. If people move away from Mathews, they have families in Mathews that know where they are. And then when they get done with their careers, they move back to Mathews. So I started going there again on my days off from work. I would go down to Mathews. I made a few calls. I go down there with a little list of people to talk to. And every person I talked to, I would say, "You know anybody else down here that has something to do with this?" And invariably people would say, "Yeah, you go down to the end of the creek and talk to this guy. His father got torpedoed." Or talk to this lady. Her uncle was killed by a U-boat. And I just kept finding more and more and more stories. And I would every time I came home, I had a longer list than the one I had gone there with. And I told my wife, I said, "I'm going backwards in this research." But eventually I found so many of these guys, and they had been everywhere. It's a small county. In World War II, maybe 8,500 people. But these guys were scattered on ships all over the world, and they were there at the beginning of the war when we were just getting our butts kicked, and they were there through the end when we figured out the U-boats, and they won the day. And I was able to tell the whole story of the Merchant Marine through these adventures of these guys, and they were amazing adventures. They're stories that I had never heard before, and I don't think most people have heard before, because they didn't take place during famous battles that have been well chronicled, but these lonely encounters out at sea with the U-boats. And just as an example, the book opens with a story of the ring. It is a gold signet ring with the initials of GDH, which stands for George Dewey Hodges. He is a Mathews sea captain. He's one of the 7 brothers in the subtitle of the book. And he was wearing this ring in July 1942 when his little freighter was torpedoed by a U-boat off the coast of Cuba, and he was killed. He was lost, as they say, in Mathews. And shortly thereafter, this ring was discovered in the belly of a big shark, caught in the waters not far from where the ship went down. So anyway, I'm going to be quiet now and let Bill take over with his book. But I'd be happy to, if we have time, be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, sure. Well, Bill Walker is the author of Betrayal at Little Gibraltar, a German fortress, a treacherous American general, and the battle to end World War I.
This is a session that's calculated to warm the hearts of bibliophiles. The start of my project in about 1993 was very similar to Bill's project. I was on a very cold winter's day trying to avoid work at Gettysburg College, and I was in the library, and I was looking at some books about World War I wanted to visit some of the sites in France. And as I was looking through this one volume, I began to notice marginalia. And the man who had written the marginalia was very angry. And he began to say, this is not the truth. This should have been another division that did this, or something of that sort. So finally he reached a point and he just wrote in the book, in the margin, this is an inaccurate account. If you want to know what really happened, turn to page 638. So I turned to page 638, and what I found was an affidavit. Turns out that the man who wrote it was named Harry Parkin. He was a Harvard graduate, had been to law school at Harvard, graduated in the same class as Franklin Roosevelt. And he, in this affidavit, and he signed it and dated it and gave the witnesses to the affidavit, charges a major general in the U.S. Army of disobeying orders, which led to a failure to capture a major German fortress in World War I and led to disaster in the Meuse-Argonne campaign. The general's name is Robert E. Lee Bullard. I guess you would guess that he was from the southern states. He was from Alabama. And his name was not Robert E. Lee at the beginning. His name was William. And he asked his father to rename him Robert E. Lee Bullard. He went to West Point. In this affidavit, and it's reprinted in the book, you can see the handwritten copy. At the end of this, Harry Parkin writes, Bullard received all the high military decorations of America, France, England, and Belgium. What he deserved was a long term in military prison for deliberately murdering hundreds of American soldiers. And those are pretty harsh words, but unlike Bill, my project was almost stillborn. I was not looking for a project in World War I. I put the book back on the shelves, and yet I must admit it was like listening to the story of the ancient mariner. I could not get it out of my head. But when I came back to find the book several weeks later, I couldn't find the book. I hadn't recorded the name of the book, and it took me actually 2 trips to the library to find this. But what I found was a story that will really shock you about what happened in France to our soldiers. The key to this story is this structure. It is a ruined building, and in 1916, the Crown Prince of Germany built an observatory, and you can see the top part of the observatory inside the attic. He had his engineers mate a powerful telescope to a periscope, a naval periscope, and the men inside the building could spot targets for the artillery. And Pershing was planning in 1918, Pershing was planning an offensive in this area, and if they didn't take this facility from the Germans could have used it to blast the American soldiers to kingdom come. It was heavily protected. It was called the Little Gibraltar of the Western Front. You can see the machine gun bunker in the upper left, a bunker for soldiers that held more than 1,000 soldiers in the right, a lot of artillery that protected the butte. And the whole area, as you can see at the lower left, was just peppered with craters from artillery. So it would be a hard target. To make sure that it was taken, Pershing planned two things. Number one, the 79th Division, which was the weakest division in the American forces, would attack from the front to hold them. And the 4th Division, which was on the right, would sweep up through a relatively undefended area and then turn Montfaucon. That's the area that shoots over to the left. It would circle around behind Montfaucon and take the hill from behind. Everything seemed to be set for that to happen very quickly on the first day of battle. Unfortunately, General Bullard interceded. He rewrote the orders that were given to him by Pershing's staff, and the 79th was forced to take the hill on its own. And this is the slope that they went up to take the hill. It was murder. Some 1,500 to 2,000 men were killed and wounded in this attack. And for some reason or another, the Montfaucon was stalled. It gave the time enough for the Germans to bring in troops to stall the American offensive, and it was stalled for 3 weeks. Pershing chose to blame the general who commanded the 79th, and he was sent home to the U.S., which was a real disgrace, and he settled in Stanton, Virginia, which is where I live now. I didn't know that until I had moved to Stanton. This was an ominous delay. The German general said, at the end of the first day, we knew we were home free. We knew we had stopped these people. And any time on a battlefield there's a delay, it means that there are going to be more people killed. There was, in fact, a 3-week delay, and because of that delay, approximately 122,000 U.S. troops were killed and wounded. Montfaucon, we know today, by the way, it's still the biggest and the bloodiest battle in American history, still. Bigger than D-Day, bigger than the Battle of the Bulge. It was proclaimed an American victory, but it never took its objectives. Now, how did I unravel the mystery? And we swapped some stories, and if you want to hear some of these stories, I visited the National Archives probably 25 times. I took a close look at Parkin's affidavit. I thought it was an old soldier story, but it proved at every step I found material, documents that back this up. And I never thought I could prove it with documentary evidence, but that's what I found. Library of Congress, National Archives, and I visited the battlefield probably 10 times. Fascinating place. The writer was Major Harry Parkin. He earned a bachelor's degree at Harvard. He was later wounded and captured. He won the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the number 2 medal behind the Medal of Honor. He was obsessed with Montfaucon and with Bullard. At one of his reunions in the 30s, a chaplain told him, "Didn't you know that, number one, Bullard refused to help us and he rewrote the orders?" Harry did not know that, but was obsessed for the rest of his life. Now, how did Pershing, I've also claimed that Pershing covered this up. The memoirs that were written by Pershing after the war were written by members of his staff, his post-war staff. One of them was Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was assigned to do the chapter on the Montfaucon. He wrote pretty straightforwardly that the 4th Division, which was Bullard's division, failed to turn Montfaucon. Turning is that motion of enveloping it from the rear. Now, what I found at the Library of Congress was the typescript of Pershing's memoirs. Pershing struck out those very direct words of General Eisenhower and substituted this language, which you can see is an obfuscation. Through some misinterpretation of the orders of the First Army, no agency there, right? There's no person mentioned. The opportunity to capture Montfaucon that day was lost. Doesn't blame anybody. And that's what Pershing hoped to do. What's happening here, and I would imagine there are a few, or at least one or two West Point graduates, the West Point Protective Association was coming into play. And that is a mythical organization of graduates who protect each other's reputation. And Pershing decided to protect Bullard's reputation and pinned the problem on Cameron. Here are the two orders. And if you'll look at the two orders, one, the original order commands that Bullard's corps will turn Montfaucon within the zone of action of Cameron's corps. Then Bullard revised the order and said we will turn Montfaucon, but not by advancing into the area of the 79th, which is the only way you could turn it, but by continuing to go on. And what Bullard was hoping to do is to set a record for the longest advance on the first day of the battle. Here's General Bullard. I think you can see from his face and what sort of person he was. In his memoirs, Bullard bragged about being reprimanded 6 times for disobeying orders. He also sneered at his former commander, the man who saved him, for being a loyal adherent to orders. He said, Pershing never disobeys an order. He always goes along. Bullard stated that he disliked complex attacks. He just wanted to go at the enemy straight with none of these envelopments. Now, why would Bullard do this? The reason he did it is he and Cameron were in competition for a command of the Second Army, and only he or Cameron would win that command. He wanted to make sure that Cameron didn't win it, and Cameron did not. Let me tell you about the human cost, just very briefly. This man was a captain in the battle. His name was Ben Hewitt. People loved him. His men loved him. Very kind person. When most of his men were wiped out in this attack, he came to Harry Parkin and said, I want to help. What can I do? Parkin assigned him a portion of his men. He was charging a German position, was shot in the chest. Parkin and his men loaded him on a stretcher, and they watched him go back on the battlefield. And as he was out about 300 yards, a German shell landed on the stretcher, and all they found was one rubber heel from his boot. It destroyed the 4 men carrying the stretcher and the stretcher. Sinkler Manning was the son of the governor of South Carolina. 6 of the governor's sons volunteered to serve. He was a close friend of Harry Parkin. When Harry Parkin was shot and captured by the Germans, he decided that he would try to recapture Parkin. He charged the German lines carrying his cane, and the officers carried a cane to direct the men. And he was shot through the head with a German machine gun. He was awarded the DSC and was buried at Arlington with 5 of his brothers serving as pallbearers. Harry Parkin decided to move away from his home of Pittsburgh, went to Los Angeles, and became a very, very successful land developer. He was awarded a DSC for his heroism. His grandson has told me that he never had a good day after the war. Unfortunately, he took, I'm told, to drink, and he was obsessed with Montfaucon. He lived a mile from a general by the name of Booth, who was investigating this incident. They never met, and Booth determined the truth about what happened at Montfaucon, put it into a file, and I was lucky enough to see that file in the National Archives. And it's filled with smoking guns about what Bullard did. General Bullard, he was one of the top 3 generals in the American Expeditionary Force after the war. He became a lieutenant general. He then retired and went to work for a think tank called the National Security League. And the National Security League was warning the country about radical professors. I never ran into any of those at UVA when I was there. He talked about Mexican revolutionaries, and he wanted to arm civilians for defense. To me, that sounds remarkably like one of the 2 people who ran for the presidency last time. Bullard was out for himself. He was paid to appear in a Lucky Strike ad that appeared in a lot of newspapers and magazines, and he was criticized by his compatriots after that. Died a happy man in New York City in 1948. This, have you ever seen this? Has anybody here ever seen this monument? Do you know what it is? It's the Montfaucon Monument. It is the largest American military monument outside the U.S., 225 feet tall. It was designed by the guy who designed the Jefferson Memorial, and it stands on Montfaucon Hill. The amazing thing, the 79th assault is not mentioned, and Montfaucon is today forgotten. It's a beautiful place. The ruins are there, the ruins church of a monastery, and a lot of German ruins as well. But what I had to ask at the end of my book was, does this monument mark the site of a victory, or does the grandeur of this monument mask the defeat and the debacle that happened on this battlefield? John?
Okay, Bill, thank you. So I've got some questions for both bills, but certainly would rather hear your questions, and I'm sure they would as well. So anybody have any questions to start, and do we have our microphone? We do have our microphone people available.
Yeah, this is for Bill Jarreau. In your book, you note the fact that it took the U.S. almost a year to start using effective anti-submarine operations off our own coast, even though the British, who wanted the supplies, were pleading for us to do so. And do you have any insights as to how something that, in hindsight seems so incredibly irresponsible happened?
Yeah, I mean, there were a number of reasons for that. Basically, we were really not prepared when we were thrust into the war, and we didn't have the ships and planes that we really needed to have to really set up a good convoy system. But it really went beyond that, because the convoy duty for military types is not, there's nothing particularly glamorous about it. It's basically babysitting these big, slow, lumbering ships, and a lot of the feeling in the military was we need to be going out there and getting these guys, not just shepherding these things up and down the coast. And it took us a while to figure out that these U-boats had come thousands of miles but we couldn't find U-boats. I mean, you couldn't. It's hard to find a U-boat in the ocean. And a lot of these U-boat commanders they'd been fighting the British for years, so they were cagey veterans. They knew all the tricks, and we didn't know any of them. And fighting a U-boat is a very specialized form of warfare, and so it took us a while to get caught up to what they were doing, and it took us a while to figure out that if you really wanted to fight U-boats, the best way to do it was to be with merchant ships, because the U-boats had come a long way to sink those merchant ships. And if you wanted to find a U-boat, the best way to do it was to be near their targets. They were basically bait. There was also a guy, Admiral Ernest King, who was basically had operational command of the Navy. And he had a kind of a notorious dislike for the British, and the British would say, here's what you need to do, and he'd say, forget these guys. And he had a lot on his plate. There was chaos in the Pacific, and we were trying to get troops over to Britain but he just did not make convoys a priority, and he resisted any attempts to use private, the civilian planes, and to use, they were getting like big sailboats to help with convoy duty. And he wasn't really interested in any of that. He said, this is how we're going to do it. He's a stubborn guy that, everything had to be done his way. And he said, I've got a plan for convoys. And at some point, toward the end of this first year, we're going to have enough ships and planes. We're cranking them out of the shipyards and the aircraft factories. We'll have enough to have a really good convoy system, which we did. But he was, it was really according to his schedule and his plans, rather than a response to any sort of quick response to the carnage that was taking place right along our shorelines. And so it was a combination of reasons. And King even showed no enthusiasm for blacking out the coastal cities, even though it was apparent to anybody who is, and people on the coast, living there didn't always recognize it, but certainly anybody in the Navy or anybody that had been to sea knew that it was dangerous. It was dangerous to have a brightly lit city and have these ships trying to sneak past it. But he showed very little enthusiasm for that. So it was a great failure on his part, and a part really of the United States military early in the war, to take so long to recognize the importance of doing this and to do something to keep these guys from, and it wasn't just the guys that were being killed. We lost, a ship loaded with supplies. I mean, it could supply an army for a period of time. So we were losing just an extraordinary amount of ships and fuel. And as you say, the British did complain. The British, a lot of it was going to them, and they finally said, you got to do something. And even the oil companies were, who owned these tankers that were getting torpedoed, they were petitioning for the lights to be put out, even though they were the ones who were profiting from the lights being on. So it just took a lot of browbeating to get the country and the military to do what it should have done much earlier. Does that answer your question?
For Mr. Walker, has your research been used by the Army to try to restore Cameron's reputation?
I've had a lot of conversations with people both at Carlisle, which is the War College, and at the Staff and Command College. But it takes a long time. I'm an educator. I think of myself as an educator. I taught for some years. And there are treatises on how an Army learns. And it takes a long time for an Army to learn. And I think if my book is ever used by the military, it will be some years down the line.
Mr. Walker, whatever happened to Little Gibraltar?
To whom?
Little Gibraltar.
Little Gibraltar now belongs to the federal government. It was the U.S. government did not want to buy a lot of land. So if you go to most of the battlefields, don't belong to the U.S. They're still French territory. But a bunch of people got together and purchased the top of the butte, which is flat, maybe 10 acres, and it actually belongs to the U.S. government. It's under the control of a superintendent who runs the Moose-Argonne Cemetery, where 14,000 of our kids are buried. And if you go there today, it's a fascinating place. You can go up in the monument. I've forgotten the number of steps to the top, but you get a wonderful view of the whole battlefield, 20 miles wide. And also, there are numerous bunkers that you can go into, just like they were at the beginning, where the Germans were with machine guns or observation posts. And it's a wonderful place to visit. Unfortunately, it lies about 20 miles north of the interstate highway that goes from Paris or Rennes to Germany. And to get there, you have to go on very narrow back roads that are clogged by cattle and sheep. And it's awfully hard to get there. But if you're ever there, please go. You will see some remarkable things.
This is for Mr. Jarreau. We're from a coastal city in Texas, and growing up, we heard stories about how close the Germans got to the city we're from. And the story was that the Germans ship captains were told to get in as close as possible, not just for destroying the ships, but for psychological warfare on the people in the cities and the people manning the ships. Did you run across any of that in your studies?
The head of the U-boat command, Admiral Carl Dönitz, believed very much in psychological warfare. He wanted the U-boats to, in fact, when he sent the first wave of them over, he instructed them to position themselves along the coast and then attack in concert at the same time for maximum effect. He wanted and he only sent 5 the first time, but he wanted Americans to believe that our waters were just crawling with U-boats. I didn't run across anything of him specifically telling U-boats to get close to shore so people could see them. And in the accounts of U-boat commanders who sank ships close to shore, they didn't express a preference for doing it, but there was one case, a ship was torpedoed off the coast of Florida near Jacksonville, and there were like tourists. It was like in daylight, and tourists were out there including some military guys who were on leave down there, and were watching this ship explode. And the U-boat commander noted afterwards, we put on a show for the tourists. So it was something that they really wanted to do, and it certainly is entirely possible that a U-boat commander down there was told or took it upon himself to try to make himself visible to spook everybody, because that was very much what they wanted to do. It was a lot of the ships that they sank, the shipping lanes were far enough offshore that a lot of the sinkings did not. Some took place right off, where you could see them, where people witnessed them. But in many cases, they took place a little farther off because that's where the ships were. But yeah, they absolutely could have wanted to do that, because they wanted us to think that we were not safe. I mean, they torpedoed ships right at the mouth of the Mississippi River, just coming out of the passes where the river empties into the Gulf. And in trying to think of a couple of other examples, but yes, they wanted very much for us to know that they were there and to think that there were more of them there than there were. I don't know does that answer your question?
They did do some psychological warfare in that early in the war, when they sank merchant ships, the U-boats would typically only take the ship captain prisoner. Mm-hmm. And the idea was to discourage deck officers from wanting to go to sea as a captain.
Yes.
My father actually was in the Merchant Marine for 60 years, starting as a deck officer during World War II. And one of the captains in the company he was with, his ship was sunk, and he made it. It became a bit of a publicity because when his ship was sinking, they all got in the lifeboats, and the submarine surfaced, and they directed the lifeboats to come to the submarine. And when they got there, they asked the U-boat skipper asked who was the captain, and this fellow, Captain Stevenson, stood up and said, "I'm the captain." And the U-boat skipper said, "You're coming with us. The rest of you can go back to the States, and you head that way 30 or 40 miles, whatever it was." And Stevenson turned around and directed his lifeboat back to his ship. And the U-boat skipper said, "What are you doing?" And Stevenson said, "If I'm going to be your prisoner, I want my cigars." And the skipper said, "I've got cigars." He said, "I don't want stinking Nazi cigars." So everyone watched the lifeboat go back to the ship, watched Stevenson climb up to his stateroom, get his cigars, and come back to his ship. And so when his crew got back to the States, they reported this to their friends in the papers. And so this was publicized as the U.S. is defying the Nazis. Now, a little aside, the irony of this is that Captain Stevenson and the U-boat skipper became friends. And after the war, sometime after the war, Captain Stevenson retired out to Montauk on the eastern end of Long Island. And the U-boat skipper became a salesman for a German chemical company. And he did a lot of work, a lot of business in the U.S. And so whenever he was in the New York City area, he always contacted my father. And my father would send a limo out to Montauk from New York City to pick up Captain Stevenson, to bring him into New York City so the two captains could get together and have dinner or lunch or whatever and exchange stories.
That's a great story. To me, one of the most striking things I discovered, the surprising things in my research, was that there was a lot of contact between the U-boat captains and the survivors of the ships they sank. And it was very common after a U-boat would sink a merchant ship for the U-boat to surface and approach the survivors in lifeboats or on rafts and converse with them. And what the Germans mainly wanted was sometimes they would take a captain. There were other cases where they'd ask who the captain was, and the men in the lifeboats would say he's dead, even if he was in the boat, because they knew they were going to take him. But they would surface, and they would sometimes point a machine gun at these helpless men in the lifeboats or the rafts and interrogate them. What was the name of your ship? What was its cargo? Where was it going? What was its tonnage, the cargo capacity? Because that's how the U-boats measured how they were doing, how much tonnage were they sinking. And a lot of times when they would get the answers to those questions, and the men in the lifeboats often would lie to them, but when they would get answers, the U-boat would submerge and leave these men to the mercy of the sea, which in many cases was no mercy at all. But I encountered a number of examples, and there's a number in this book, where the U-boat commanders would, and they couldn't bring themselves to leave these guys out there like that. And they would surface, and after they got the information, they would offer these men food and water. They'd offer them medical attention. They'd offer to tow them part of the way to land. And one of the Mathews men was in a lifeboat after a ship was torpedoed in the Caribbean, and suddenly the U-boat surfaces. And everybody in that lifeboat must have been thinking, this is the end. But instead, the U-boat commander comes out the hatch and apologizes for having had to sink an American ship. He said, "You had a beautiful ship." He gives them food. He gives them French cookies, because the U-boat was based in occupied France, cigarettes, and he gives them a big jug of drinking water. And before he hands it over to him, he squeezes limes, fresh limes, into the water. And what he's doing is, it's not like a fancy restaurant, what he's doing is introducing vitamin C into this water to fortify these castaways against scurvy, a vitamin deficiency disease, in the event the lifeboat has to be at sea for a long time. And as the German commander the U-boat is pulling away, the German commander calls out, come and see me after the war in Germany after this is all over. So a similar case like that. Another U-boat commander just briefly astonished the men in a lifeboat by asking them how the Brooklyn Dodgers were doing, how the baseball team was doing. The U-boat commander had lived with his parents in Brooklyn before the war and was into the Dodgers. So you did have, and this is not to say that these examples like you said, I mean, that's a fascinating story. I had not heard that one, but there are a number of examples like this. But I don't mean to suggest that the U-boat war was some sort of chummy, clubby affair, because at its heart it was brutal, and other of these it just depended on the man who was in command of that U-boat, and some of these guys were just as cold as the ocean they sailed in, and they thought nothing of leaving guys out in the middle of the ocean to die, or didn't think enough of it to do it, and there was only so much they could do anyway.
As opposed to the Germans being such gentlemen, weren't there also cases where they would machine gun the survivors, or is that Hollywood? I mean, that certainly shows up in movies. Wasn't there some of the other extreme where instead of giving them supplies, they would machine gun them?
It's interesting because Hitler and but there were cases where they would just leave them there, which was, in a way, it was worse than machine gunning. You'd leave a lifeboat full of people, and there's a picture in the book of this haunting picture of these guys who are in a lifeboat or on a raft in March, hundreds of miles from land, and I mean they're doomed. And the U-boat, the propaganda photographer took a picture of them, and off they went. But Hitler and Dönitz, the head of the U-boat command, were constantly sending these edicts to the U-boat commanders saying, do not help these guys. Hitler wanted them to machine gun them. He specifically said, we want you to machine these guns in the machine gun these guys in the lifeboats, because not only are we trying to sink their ships, but as you point out, we're trying to discourage men from wanting to be merchant mariners. So stop helping these guys. Stop giving them food. Stop giving them water. At the very least, just leave them alone. But the U-boat commanders, and as I say, some of them were absolutely cold-blooded. And you can see the reports. You can see which ones were cold-blooded. But the Japanese, on the other hand, did machine gun guys in lifeboats. And they did. There are some terrible stories about that, but and I think in some of the battles with the British, there were cases where the U-boat guys would shoot them, but I didn't find any I think that was more, at least in their war against us, that was more made up. But that doesn't mean that they were. I don't want to give the impression that this was the cases as he describes were the exception rather than the rules, but a lot of these guys that was a little more than they could do to actively shoot these guys. A lot of some of the U-boat guys had been merchant mariners, for German companies before the war, and they knew that these guys they were civilians. They were hauling cargo, so they were more than happy to their mission was to sink the ships. But once that cargo was at the bottom of the sea, what do you do with these guys on a raft? And in the movie or the book Das Boot, the great German, a lot of people have seen the movie, but the book is excellent too. And there's a scene in the book where some drunken German submariners are debating what to do with what do you do with these survivors? And one said something like, "Oh, isn't it ridiculous that we're, when they're on a ship, we're trying to kill them, but once in their lifeboat, we're trying to help them. What sense does that make?" But it was a sort of a push and pull throughout the course of the war.
And let me tag on just one more comment. In my research, and I read lots of soldiers' narratives, there were many, many cases of German atrocities, ruses where Red Cross troops would drop a stretcher and have a machine gun on it and machine gun American troops. There were just as many atrocities on the American side, and I wrote about them. Felt like I had to. Both sides participated at least in World War I, in this kind of activity.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up the questions at this point. I want to thank you very much for coming, and if you have an evaluation form, be sure to fill that out. And we hope to talk to you right down there. Thank you very much.